Hi and welcome back to another video here on my channel. Thanks for joining me today. Just really a quick note before we begin. I know that there's a ton of you who are new to this channel. I've just been really surprised by the immense growth in views and subs over the past week. I really didn't expect the video on work and labor and capitalism to get that much traction, honestly, because there are tons of videos about the topic that's already out there. I'm really glad that it resonated with so many of you. I don't think that I was able to cover everything, but it seemed that the ideas that I was talking about or the books I was kind of sharing helped a little bit, or at least gave y'all the space to talk about such ideas and to hopefully move the conversation along. I'm really happy that that video was able to become that kind of resource for a lot of you, and yeah, I'm just really grateful for that. Before we move on, I just wanted to address a lot of the new subs here. On this channel, I primarily cover content that's about books, but hopefully trying to tie in, the usual booktube content into bigger thematic stuff, hopefully discussing more personal experiences as well as linking it to whatever trends that I see outside. So today's video is going to be about mental health, which is a topic that is super dear to my heart. Previously, I did do a video on mental health, which you can check out in the description box, but I did that video pretty long time ago. I think about a year ago exactly, sort of commemorating Mental Health Awareness Month, which is May, and I'm doing this really late. I'm doing this in the last week of May, and I just wanted to add on to that list of books, but also to emphasize a little bit more on reading a bit diversely in terms of mental health. If you search mental health generally, or books about mental health, you might see a particular trend going on. There's quite a few memoirs on people's experiences with mental health. There's quite a lot of self-help books out there. The general narrative around mental health nowadays is really about you are solely responsible for your health. You are solely responsible for being able to push back at life, no matter how hard life has pushed back on you, if that makes sense. If you talk about it in very political terms, it's basically neoliberalism at its best. Anything that's got to do with your well-being, it's an individual responsibility and not necessarily something that anyone can help you with, and that self-sufficiency is super key. You might have to get the right medicines, you might have to get the right diagnosis, you might be shuttled in and out of a lot of institutions, and the main focus is on curing you. The main focus is on getting you back into a sense of normalcy. But in my own journey with mental health, I've started to understand that it's not so much about getting people back to the standard of normalcy, but to question what normal really means, and to question who fits into this standard and who are we leaving out by definition of these standards. If you are someone that has ever grappled with mental health in terms of maybe the structures or caregiving, or going through some of these diagnoses yourself, or having to go through some of these experiences yourself, you would understand that mental health isn't just an individual problem. It's also a societal problem. It's also a structural problem. It's interpersonal. It's deeply tied to your culture and sense of self, identity, all sorts of things. Mental health is not just about your brain malfunctioning. It's a misalignment of so many things in your life that lead to, this inability to go about your day as best as you can, or to thrive in the best way as you as an individual, as a unique person, in a way that you can. I am quite skeptical nowadays of the very broad narratives that surround mental health, and that's why the books that I'm going to be talking about in this video specifically are mostly anthologies and collections of essays, because I feel like that's the first step in understanding and diversifying the experience of mental health, because it's really not like a one solution fits all. It's really about understanding that there is an actual person behind these labels. There is such a huge variety of ways and perspectives towards mental health. It's not just about finding the right way to diagnose someone or the right medicines to help treat someone, which is, although that is also very important in order to find suitable treatments and appropriate treatments, it's also very, very important to recognize the humanity that's behind all of this. Back in the day when I was much younger, I would have certain panic attacks, but I wouldn't know what they were. I just thought that my body was malfunctioning, but it was actually my mind and my sense of safety that was crumbling. Also with my friends or loved ones, there was a lot of unsaid understandings of when someone is not following standard procedures of what it means to be cognitively normal or behaviorally normal. It was never really spoken about or never really discussed. It was only really through learning about it through media or books, talking to friends when I was much older, having gone through courses and workshops in university, that I was really exposed to these newer understandings, or like, I guess, much more established understandings. And the thing with labels is that it can be a double sword, right? Labels allow you to identify and to find community and to find resonance, but at the same time labels can tend to be frustrating or reductive. It can be an over medicalization of certain situations that actually require a holistic approach to treatment, and all that. For myself, I had a really low point about 3 years ago, when I was caregiving for someone with pretty serious, severe depression. It was kind of bordering on BPD, but it was never really formally diagnosed, so I can't say for sure. There's no way of expressing, I guess, truly how that feels like, and there's no way of really like articulating to someone who has never really been in that position how the trauma resides in your body, or how it feels really surreal to be in that position. And I really want to push back on this very cure-based perspective. The same way that we might have a physical injury that would flare up much more easily in the future, I don't think mental illnesses or mental conditions are experiences are things that we can so easily forget or we can completely recover from either. And I just want to say that mental health has always been used as an excuse upon marginal communities, as well as people from, you know, much more oppressed identities. It's always been used as an excuse to villainize these people, to push them even down, to kind of not just, I guess, even to some extent pathologize communities, which is really upsetting. And, you know, people have to recognize that oftentimes it's because of how repressive and how suffocating a society is that people would develop coping strategies to live in a world that was not designed for them. And hopefully the books that I mentioned today will help a little bit with that. The first book is Headcase, LGBTQ Writers and Artists on Mental Health and Wellness, edited by Schroeder and Teresa Theophano. Now, this is a book that I just finished reading yesterday, and it's a collection of essays that span all sorts of genres. Basically, the collection was put together to eliminate how the LGBTQ community grapples with mental health, how it navigates mental health. And honestly, for myself, this is a topic that I really am sincerely very invested in, because, as you know, like, LGBTQ youth experience high levels of all sorts of mental health afflictions and conditions and struggles, and it's not easy. I really do think that living in this society today, and depending on where you stay, you could be in an extremely homophobic and conservative culture, and just living in that society alone, living in that culture alone, would inflict so much trauma on you. It is torture to live in a world that's really not designed for you, and where fitting in is sort of the prerequisite to feeling normal, to a standard of living. What I really appreciated about this anthology was that it was very specific about the LGBTQ community. And you would see people talk about it, like they would talk about queerness and mental health, wellness, but I've never seen an entire anthology that was dedicated to this specific intersection. And what I thought was super important was to recognize how mental health and the institution of mental illness have always been used to oppress marginal identities. And in the past, the DSIM journal, the DSIM whatever definition thing, was used to pathologize homosexuality. And we all know that mental health institutions kind of dictate what is normal. They kind of dictate what identities are normal and what appropriate relationships are supposed to look like. And if you've ever studied psychology, you would also know that these definitions and terminologies tend to be pretty fluid over time. They might feel very fixed right now, but in reality, a lot of these labels do shift along with the times. One really good example is how ADHD had massive increases in diagnosis, and people are not so sure whether this is because of increasing awareness of the condition or whether it is, an actual increasing number of cases. Nowadays, a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists are more likely to give certain diagnoses, like overdiagnosis to children as well, which is really scary when you think about it. But there are all these factors that we have to consider when we think about labels and diagnosis, and especially when it comes to identities, relationships, types of communication. And I felt like this anthology really helped in understanding that. I feel like, especially if you are not someone who identifies as queer or as part of the LGBTQ plus community, that you definitely have to read more perspectives. Being queer in the mental health system or being queer in society is just something that you cannot really expect like a straight heteronormative person to understand, because the kinds of violences that you experience psychologically is really hard to articulate. Now, moving on, the second book that I want to talk about is Don't Call Me Crazy, 33 Voices to Start the Conversation About Mental Health, edited by Jensen. Now, this is, I think, a much more approachable book talking about mental health. It's a bunch of essays from different people who have struggled with different sort of experiences, and I think this is a much more approachable book if you are starting out to read about mental health and you just want to have a good starting entry point into reading more diversely or reading much more widely. Because I think when we think of mental health nowadays, a lot of our narratives in the common discourse is really dominated by depression and anxiety, which I think are conditions that afflict us on a really large scale. But there's also so many experiences that we do not know that are not covered in mainstream media. Things like conditions such as OCD or BPD, maybe DID, as well as neurodivergent conditions. There are just so many different aspects that I'm also still learning from. I think this book will be really good for those who are just starting out in a much more friendly and approachable way. Oh yes, before I continue any further, I really want to reiterate that reading about mental health can be triggering for some people. Definitely for myself, there are some essays and some experiences that were recounted in these books that got me a little bit triggered, but really up to your discretion. I really do think that if you are ready to read about these experiences, do take the precaution to figure out what you can read, and you can also read like the blurbs or the topics to assess whether these are themes that you're comfortable tackling. So the next book I want to talk about is this book called We've Been Too Patient, Voices from Radical Mental Health, that's edited by Dr. LD Green and Kelechi Ubozoh. This is also quite a new book to me as well. This is about people talking about how the mental health system and structure has sort of failed them and how they have been turning to alternative models of healing and of community care and of coping, which are all really good things. And I really want to argue for the perspective that we have to see mental health as a holistic issue. It's not just about finding the proper psychiatric diagnosis or treatment, although that can be really helpful for a lot of people, but oftentimes it is quite inaccessible for a lot of people and expensive. And sometimes the doctors themselves or the caregivers in the system can perpetuate really unhelpful notions about mental health, and they might also contribute to more harm than we think that they do. Not saying that they all do, but I do think this is something that we have to keep in mind when we tell people to just go to therapy or just take drugs. We also have to consider that these systems are also flawed in some ways. Although they have helped people, I do think that there's always a possibility for someone to be more hurt by their doctors or by their caregivers in the system. So do take note that some of these alternative models are derived from cultures that are still discriminated against in some way, or that they don't have the same resources that once this culture is transported to another place, the original people might not have the same kind of privileges and access to the modes of healing that have been co-opted into much more dominant cultures. And one really good example is yoga as well as meditation. I do think that there's a risk of erasing the rich heritage that comes behind these healings. Just do take note of that. I think that if we practice yoga and meditation, it's really good to understand the context of it. So back when I was studying mindfulness as a psychology course, back in university, my undergraduate days, we had to learn about Buddhism, about Zen Buddhism, the origins of it, the philosophy of it, in order to understand the applications of mindfulness in a sort of intervention program way. So I think that's really, really important. If you want to study about yoga, it's really important to study the history of it, why we do the things that we do, why people might have certain positions, what it's supposed to cultivate, and there's a need to respect the culture as well. Okay, moving on, I do have a version of an anthology that's much more for a Singaporean context. So if you're a Singaporean viewer, please read this book, and that is The White Book, Behind Mental Health Stigma. And this is really like everything that you really need about mental health in Singapore, honestly. It's variety of perspectives, all based in Singapore, and there's also a bunch of resources at the back that's super useful. I think there was one story of a mother who was suffering from postpartum depression, which was something I never really thought about. Do pick this book up for an anthology of different perspectives here in Singapore. I really think it's such a gem. I'm so glad that it's published. One thing that's in common with all these different books is that they take the perspective of critiquing mental health institutions and structures as a systemic thing, pushing back against the idea that mental health is an individual problem, that it's something that can be solved pretty easily by medicine. And so moving forward, I do want to really highlight this one book called Crazy Like Us, The Globalization of the American Psyche by Ethan Waters. This is a book that I once recommended on my channel, but I think I didn't recommend it again after that, which is quite surprising because it's such a good book in my opinion. This is sort of like an anthropological inquiry into how the American system of mental health has been exported into various contexts outside of the American context. And you might think that this is a good thing. I do think that it's great to have a certain standard of researching and of diagnosing illnesses. At the same time, everything has to be done in moderation. And this book really highlights the negative consequences of carelessly implementing certain standards without investigating the cultural nuances that might differ from context to context. This book is really talking about how mental health as we know it is also so differently influenced by the country's climate, background, culture, different forms of identity. Is as much a societal thing as it is an individual thing. People respond to setbacks and they respond to failures and all sorts of hard knocks in life so differently. I also do think it's a book about resilience in some ways, but also there's a huge critique about the massive kind of commercialization or corporatization of mental health and pharmacies, like what's it called, the medical industry, pharmaceuticals I can't pronounce that, but yes, there's a massive critique about how if these companies are turning in for profit, that it makes sense to invent or to push forward a diagnosis that would diagnose as many people as possible, and then to prescribe them as much medicine as possible in order to keep churning out those pills and keep churning out that sort of consistent revenue. For me, when I read it when I was about 22 or something, and it really opened my eyes to how there can be all these really problematic aspects to what we think is, infallible, which is the health system, and as well as whoever we think as authoritative voices in health, which are like doctors and I guess researchers and scientists. Basically, you can buy your way anywhere in any sort of industry in this world. This book really highlighted that to me. So I would really, really recommend this book in terms of it's a much more sociological take on mental health, but it has been super pivotal in the way that I think about mental health as a whole, in terms of the structure and in terms of power dynamics, everything. So that has been super important for me. Now that's all for this video. I'm so sorry for the background noise. I tried my best to record this as quietly as I can. So now that we've come to the end of the video, I do hope that there's some of these titles that you might want to pick up, and that maybe there are also certain directions that you might want to read up more about when it comes to mental health, especially in your books. Again, I recommend mostly non-fiction, so if there are fiction books about mental health that you would like to share with me, do feel free to share them in the comments down below. I do hope that me talking about these books as well as sharing my own experience really pushes forth the idea that mental health is not this like monolithic thing that we all experience the same way. I do really think that mental health is really different for everyone, and what we can all do is to push forward for solutions that enable people to be different but to thrive in their own unique communities and their own unique identities, to recognize that each person has their own strengths and weaknesses, and that we all have resilience in us to face the day, and at the same time be able to hold systems accountable for the way that they might discriminate against certain people, for the way that they might perpetuate harm towards certain people. This is something that I don't think we talk a lot about, the fact that sometimes it's the structures that inflict these harms upon us and keep us in those places of harm, instead of providing a safe space for us to be ourselves and to connect with other people. I don't really know what the conclusion of this video is. Basically, I just hope that you would pick up a book about mental health that talks about a perspective that you might not really hear in mainstream media, and that you might pick up, a book that would change your perspective on mental health, or that would at the very least give you some comfort and resonance with regards to the experience that you might have when it comes to mental health, for yourself, for your loved ones, for your community, for the society. That's all I really want to achieve with this video. So thank you for sticking with me all the way to the end. I know this was a very draggy video. I was just kind of struggling to find the words to describe all of this, and I also kind of had a difficult time reading some of these books because they did trigger some old memories, and so I had to take some downtime to figure out how I was going to read these books and how I was going to talk about them. So it might have come out in a way that was a bit fragmented, so I apologize for that. But if you stayed all the way to the end, thank you so much for sticking with me till the end, even though this is probably one of the most rambly videos I've filmed. And thank you so much again for the support on my previous videos. I'm really glad that whatever I've been doing has been helpful to some of you at least. I do hope that you're staying safe with your loved ones, and that wherever you are in life right now, I do hope that there's something that's worth sticking out in life for. I do wish you love and beauty. I do wish you a thriving life, and really fulfilling relationships with whoever that might come into your life. But thank you so much. Yeah, and I'll just see you in the next video.